Welcome back to the Agati Video Podcast. This is a space where we host conversations with different designers, architects, and industry thought leaders to help educate you in your work. My name is Joe Agati, and I'm COO and Director of Design here at Agati Furniture. Today, I have the opportunity to talk with several guests about how library redesign has gone from ideation to implementation. Each of my guests, including the team here at Agati, have been working together on an incredible redesign of the John Hitt Library at the University of Central Florida, which has begun in 2003. Joining me today is Frank Allen, Senior Associate Director of John C. Hitt Library, Amanda Rienth, a principal at Steinberg Hart, with extensive experience in both public and academic libraries, and Delia Nevola, a principal in charge of the project with Steinberg Hart, with extensive experience in higher education, library spaces, and more. In preparation for today's podcast, I actually had the opportunity to go with Frank and tour the space ahead of time. It was a very unique environment, and it has a really unique story to tell, and that's kind of what's drawn me to it. So welcome to the podcast today, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Frank, I wanted to start with you, since you're at the library, to get your first kind of perspective on background of the project and the space itself.
All right. Well, thank you, Joe. It's great to be here. And when you mentioned the date of 2003, it is a little shocking that we've been working on this project that long. But I had talked to other colleagues around the country early in our planning, and it's not unusual for these to take this long. But the background and goals. The background in a nutshell is that we needed a new library. The John C. Hitt Library, even in 2003, was going on 45 years old, and had one renovation in 1984. But by 2003, and certainly by 2011, it was badly in need of major renovation. So from a system standpoint, let alone the usability and the changes in students' study habits and needs. So it took a while to convince the university that a major renovation was needed. But there were a couple of turning points. In 2006, this was aside from our work with Steinberg, we opened a cafe in the building, and the students just converted space into a cafe, and the students just flooded into the space. And the university administration noticed it. And it was a very well done project. And then in 2010, we did what was popular at the time, created what was called a knowledge commons. Which was basically early efforts at converting book space to student space. Information commons, knowledge commons, those were popular terms that were used around the turn of the century. So we did one of these projects that came online in 2010, and it was an even bigger success. So we really were getting the university's attention. And it was about that time that our architects with Steinberg had been working on the project scope for a while, but that's when the project really got serious.
Is that the time you guys decided to go to like the kind of big automated book retrieval?
2011-ish. Delia and Amanda can speak to that. So I could mention some of the goals of the project, but I think Amanda and Delia might be able to speak to that better, because they did a great job of laying out year after year what are our overarching goals with this project.
Okay.
And so I may let you all speak to that.
Okay. So yeah, I guess question to Delia and Amanda, being the architects on the project. I guess I'd like to get your kind of take on the background and, when you guys got involved and how you guys got involved with it.
Well, I was involved pretty early on.
Hmm.
So I would say probably around the 2011
Okay.
timeframe. And at that time, I think on the goals topic, we had already established the guiding principles for the project.
Hmm.
And those guiding principles, we've sort of been addressing them every single time we do another renovation, because this project has been phased and has had several different renovations over the years. But these have more or less stayed the same. And those goals are innovation, place for gathering and collaboration, distinctive identity, partnership with community, and active design. And so those were the 5 things that we continued to focus on throughout our design process, from the very beginning, from advanced thematic design, and now all the way through to this third renovation we're on now.
And then I think ultimately, to the point about the books and the art, I think there was this like phrase that kept getting tossed around at the time, and it's been used so much now, I think people look past it, but really it had this goal of being like the 21st century library, kind of that notion of the knowledge commons, basically exchanging books for space for the students. And so ultimately, we did develop the ARC because there just wasn't places to put the books in order to have places for the students to sit. And so, the ARC was built, the Automated Retrieval Center, we call it ARC for short, ARC. And that's where the majority of the books have gone into. And we initially even planned, Frank, to keep some of those books out on the floor. I think like 250,000, and we're slowly marching towards 0 books out on the floor, actually. We really needed every single solitary square foot as we do that each step for student space.
Yeah, I remember when I first visited the library and there were just students sitting on the floor in between the stacks. They just, they loved being at the library, but they really had nowhere to sit. And
Right.
particularly when it came to outlets, right? With the using computers and devices constantly, you needed to learn that.
Just to elaborate on that conversion from books to people space, I think this is a classic example of what in the real estate industry is referred to as highest and best use. The library is literally in the dead center of campus. So it is very valuable real estate. And it took a little while, but I think suddenly all the powers to be on campus realized that the best use of this space was no longer as a book warehouse. And that's giving all due respect to books. But essentially, that's what historically an academic library was, a book warehouse with some seating around the perimeter. So, I mean, really, if you had to describe this project in a sentence or two, it would be a repurposing of tens of thousands, a couple of 100,000 square feet of space from books to people space. And you're right, the students were sitting on the floor back before we started adding seating. And this is kind of interesting. We had to take offline an entire 4th floor. I'm getting ahead of myself, getting ahead of ourselves, but they're back to sitting on the floor again because we have temporarily took about 900 seats offline. So, but yeah, that's the real story, is the highest and best use was people space, study space, learning space.
So going back to like the ARC and the automated retrieval, the automated retrieval system, like you're talking about. So was that was part of the strategy, like early on, I guess? And is that something that was kind of like pushed by you guys, Steinberg Hart, to kind of like, hey, there's not really going to be a way to achieve what we want to, or were there other ideas talked about? And then how did you guys, if there were, how did you guys settle on the automated retrieval?
Well, there were a lot of ideas tossed around, as you could imagine. Some of them as wild as sort of taking over some of the adjacent building to provide enough space for all of this. And I think just understanding the library's desire to keep books and have room for growth, but be able to have all of this space for students, it really was the sort of best solution. I mean, at the time, I think even compact shelving, when we did a study, it would have taken up too much space even.
Okay.
I don't know, Frank, do you want to add anything since you were?
Yeah, there was an early plan. Mr. Holzman, Malcolm Holzman, we had an early plan to create a 450,000 square foot library, which, in other words, to achieve the seating and keep the collection intact in traditional cantilevered shelving would have required well over 400,000 square feet. And you can imagine the price was like outrageous. And the university just immediately rejected it on price. And so that's when everybody went back to the chalkboard, so to speak. And I don't know who came up with the idea to do the high density robotic shelving, but somebody did, and it quickly became the solution. You know, I think I've always heard there's a density factor of somewhere between 7 and 9 to 1. In other words, with the robotic high bay, you get anywhere from 7 to 9 times as much book storage per ground floor square foot of ground space as you would with traditional library shelving. So that was the key that unlocked the whole door, because we wanted to have both seating and maintain the collection on site. Interesting.
I forget, like, there's some amount of minutes it takes from when you request a book to when that book is in your hands, and it's really low.
Right, and it's come down, and that's the advantage. You know, the automated retrieval is expensive, but the alternative is offsite storage, which can take anywhere from, I mean, if you want to make a special trip, 2 hours to 2 days. So we have it down to about 5 minutes. So if a student or a faculty member or a patron, is browsing on the online catalog and sees an item they like, they hit what I call the get it button, boom, hit the button. And the robot, of course, immediately engages. And almost by the time the patron walks to the service desk, the book is already waiting for them. So it is a very convenient arrangement for the patron, as opposed to having to wait.
And it looked like when I was there, you still had capacity to, I mean, I know there's probably always going to be continual weeding of collection, but it seemed like you still had capacity, at least to add in more shelving. And I don't know, do you still have capacity inside the shelving you do have still?
The existing 3 bays are pretty much full. We do have additional capacity in the ARC. We call it the Automated Retrieval Center. There is additional capacity to build new bays.
Okay.
If we can find the funding. It's so.
How much has the price gone up? Like, because you did this pre-COVID, pre-pandemic.
You all can speak to that.
Is it? Yeah, it's been much more dramatic.
Delia?
Yep. Yes, it's been very dramatic.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in fact, it's kind of posed a bit of a challenge, just because when we first installed the ARC, it was expensive, but when you sort of looked at your return on that investment, and not monetary return, but just sort of what it allowed the library to do, it was well worth it. So I think today we're looking at costs that are 3 to 4 times when we did it then. So there are some challenges in terms of adding more of those bays because of what happened with the economy.
Does that offset then? Is it like, well, now that it costs that much more, does it make it more appealing just to make a building bigger then? Or is it still more cost effective to say, no, like shrink the book footprint?
I think the latter. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of things. So, I mean, first of all, we are still looking at adding 2 rows, but we are also looking at doing something slightly more traditional. And we're also talking about, of course, we're constantly talking about these things, but we're also talking about maybe putting special collections into that space, that it has its own location, which would be very helpful. Because right now, special collections has its own space, but we want to try and maybe reuse that for student space.
Okay.
So I think we came to the notion that there's certain collections that you want the students to have in their hands in 5 minutes. And then there's other collections that maybe aren't as critical to be in their hands in 5 minutes. So we're looking at more of a standard 5-bay shelf that a person has to go and get the book. Again, it's right there on campus, but maybe the time would be 15 to 20 minutes versus 5 minutes for a staff person to go and get something off the shelf. That still, I think, hasn't been implemented, so the timing hasn't been tested. But the library's definitely been thinking, which collections are most critical for that, like for quick access, and maybe which ones aren't as critical in terms of the storage. But ultimately, the goal is still just to get the materials off the floor and into the building, regardless of sort of how we ultimately end up deciding is the right direction to go in.
Well, if I could also just comment here in all truthfulness, and I think the audience will appreciate this, partly because we're maxing out with the 3 aisles and we don't know if and when we will get the additional 2 aisles in whatever configuration it is. We are doing a deep dive, a deep analysis of our print collection, and we are doing some deaccessioning, which I think almost every academic library in the country is, if they're not doing it now, they're seriously studying it, because there's obvious trends in the format of academic, especially I would say academic library source material moving digital, maybe even more so than public libraries. So we're also, just out of necessity, we're doing some careful deaccessioning, and it's fine. It's fine. Like any collection or a garden, the word weeding, it's healthy to go through and extract materials that just are no longer needed or have been superseded in digital format.
So kind of maybe along these lines, and Delia, you kind of brought this up too, is kind of the phased approach. And you had said earlier, like, hey, as we've been doing phases, like, we have our goals that we've started with, but we've learned. And that's one of the reasons that's kind of drawn me to this story a little bit. Not that people don't do things in phases, but I think it seemed like a very deliberate approach, knowing that, hey, there's some drawbacks to this, but yet the drawbacks are going to be way minimized compared to like the really beneficial outcomes. I guess I want to just expand on that a little bit. One, what has evolved, as in the background, what has evolved through the phasing process and how that's gone, at least from your guys' perspective.
Yeah, well, I think that for the library, the phasing was important because, again, they're living in the space while construction's happening. So you're trying to take the least amount of seats offline, to Frank's point earlier, in order to do the work, come in and do a pretty quick renovation, and then bring them back online. That's a positive for operations. It's also a pain for operations because the library is living with a renovation or in a renovation state for over 10 years, right? So they're constantly having to warn students about noise, about disruption, about where they can and can't go. And so I think that's been just probably more so from Frank's side of library operations point, a little bit tricky. For us, though, what it's provided is actually a real positive, which is that each of these phases is student funded. So we've always been very focused. UCF, Frank has always been very focused on the students are paying for the majority of these renovations. What do the students, what are they asking for? What do they need? And so we've been at every phase kind of constantly reevaluating that. Frank and his team have been very successful in just sharing very detailed observations. We've implemented furniture surveys to the students. They've had, I think the library's done some focus groups with students. We've solicited a lot of feedback. And so it's allowed us to not have too long go by or too much of something before we can kind of self-correct if something didn't work as we planned it to. So the whole thing has been this really incredible case study almost for the firm and for the library, but it's meant that we never make like too major of a mistake because we have that next chance to kind of adjust or correct for whatever maybe didn't go according to plan on the prior phase. So it's kind of these little mini moments as opposed to some big passive, thing. And that's been a positive. So I think there's probably some pain points, but positives throughout the entire process.
Yeah, it's almost like we are doing post-occupancy evaluations on a consistent basis, which is it's really pretty incredible to do and just continue to evolve and correct as time goes on.
Yeah, it seems like, I know when I've talked to architects, interiors, people in the past, I think the real challenge, you have a lot of challenges, but one of the big challenges, like when you build a building or you renovate the building, it's kind of like a prototype, right? It's like different every time. It's not like, you're just pumping out like from someone in a manufacturing perspective, right? And we customize modifier stuff, but lots of times it's like we're making the same thing over and over again. So you can kind of dial it in. A renovation in new buildings, like it's different every time, right? And so the phase approach, again, like you're saying, seems to have this like, maybe there's a cost impact to it, but the longer term outcome seems to be much better. Frank, would you kind of share, and you have that similar experience, you feel like?
Sure. So, Delia, I don't know if you recall, the original phasing was supposed to be, so the library proper, the original building that was built in the late 60s was roughly 100,000 square feet. There was a 1984 addition that was another roughly 100,000 square feet. So you got two equal size chunks. The original plan, as I recall, this is going way back, was that one of those two structures was going to be renovated top to bottom, and everything would get shoved into the other side. And then when that structure was renovated, we would reverse it and do the other half and shove everything. Well, I had nightmares visualizing how that was going to go. Well, so as it turns out, the university didn't have nearly enough money to do a two-phase project, essentially. No way, not even close. So out of necessity, we're doing it floor by floor, and so horizontally, which, as it turns out, I think has been much easier to swallow and to live with. I don't know from an architectural, now see, Delia, from a system standpoint, I would imagine it might have been easier to do the first plan. But from a user standpoint, the horizontal slicing has been easier for us. But it's still not a picnic. The whole thing is a big pain in the neck. But you either do it or you don't. So, but I hadn't thought about the original phasing plan in quite some time until you brought it up, Joe. So
why is just explain a little bit more. Why do you think the horizontal phasing is better from your perspective than?
Well, instead of having to take half of the building offline, 50% offline.
Oh, okay.
We're taking off roughly 25% or 20% offline. Now, of course, that means more phases, which means more time and more money. When this project is done, it's going to have been a very, very, very expensive project.
Yeah.
But as you all were saying, Delia and Amanda, the obvious benefit by doing it one slice at a time is that we're able to go back and do minor little course corrections. And we can talk about that a little bit more. And that's been, I think, a big benefit. So
yeah, I could see that being, after touring the space, and I don't know if I was just there during a busy time or if that was like a midterm. It was
busy time.
packed.
It's always
like that.
Yeah. So I don't know how, I guess, yes, right out of necessity. I don't know how you would have taken 50% of that building off.
Exactly. It would have been
you took
great
off
hardship.
the floor and that was only what a small percentage, and that you could notice we see the impact in that. I feel like in the space.
Exactly. I've heard of libraries doing that, but I think, I mean, and this is getting into the heart of it. I think, to y'all's credit, Delia and Amanda, I mean, we've got to be doing something right. The building is mobbed. I mean, our traffic counts have gone up, let's go back to 2019. We're 60 to 70% higher than we were in 2019. Now, we do have more seating, of course, but I think it's an example of you build it, if you build it correctly. You build it and they will come. No, it's you build it correctly and they will come. So the gate counts and the occupancy have just exploded.
And the university's grown, right, in the last 5 years?
No.
Okay.
In fact, our enrollment has plateaued. Finally, it had to.
Okay.
The university grew just at almost a straight up line for about 20 years, and it finally plateaued. In fact, we had a slight reduction in enrollment. So no, that's not due to enrollment growth. It's just due to doing the project correctly.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also worth noting, we were looking up yesterday, like you guys are one of like the largest universities in the country.
We are.
Top 4, top 5 population wise. It's massive. I think it's like 68,000 students. Yeah. So very large student body. Well, kind of going along this theme, I wanted to start kind of talking. This is great background, I think, for everybody, but getting into like, what do you think has worked and what do you think has been successful in this space? And maybe Delia and Amanda, you guys could start off on that side of it.
I mean, I think that one of the things that maybe it was our biggest challenge that we found really successful was when you're facing, to Frank's point, now you're imagining, so there was a big building, second building. The ARC is now a third building that we connected to those first 2 buildings. So the sheer scale, I need to compare one of these floor plates to like a football field. I think it's bigger than a football field. It has to be, right? Like the sheer scale of one of these floor plates when you have all of those buildings connected to each other, it's massive. And if you imagine the ceiling heights not being that massive, they're really short. So each one of these floor plates is like a pancake, right? And so it's just like, I think we all thought, to Frank's point, like, how do you build it right? How do you make students want to come into this space that otherwise doesn't have a lot going for it because you're probably pretty far from a window, right? It's just a sea of seats. So now you're talking about no books, a sea of seats. And I think one of the things that on our end has been most successful is really being strategic about both furniture selection and then these like architectural kind of interventions that we've mixed in with them to make sure that it feels comfortable. It feels like a good place to be. The architectural interventions were selected. Delia did a lot of effort to find this sinker cypress material from that's like saved from swamps in Florida. And that's been clad on walls. It's been clad on furniture, or we've made the furniture, Joe, to your tables to match.
Sure.
And so we're creating lots of sort of dividers or moments with this really warm, it feels so wonderful. And then as far as the furniture goes, the students sort of called and spoke for variety because every different body shape and size finds something different comfortable or wants to study slightly differently or needs the space for something else. And so in order to make these spaces exciting, first we have the wood sort of warm architectural interventions, and then we layered furniture in and really thinking of it on how does it help acoustics? How does the height vary? How do we provide variety? And really mixing all of these things in. So it's almost thinking of the furniture as like mini architecture. Like how does the furniture make the space dynamic and exciting and engaging and acoustically comfortable and all of those things. And so it's just been this incredible opportunity to look at the entire range of what's available and begin to kind of curate that for the students And then I think maybe Delia, you could speak to, I think another thing that's been really successful is this notion of like zoning the building for noise or sound. Because part of that, like, how do students know where to go depending on what they want to do that day? That was something that I think was kind of developed pretty early on in the process.
Yeah, that's very true. And I just want to go back to the furniture really quickly because Amanda did an amazing job in finding a variety of furniture.
Mm-hmm.
It could have very easily been like a call center. And you see some libraries that don't have enough variety or enough height differential.
Mm-hmm.
And just is a sea of, these workstations or, what have you. So I think that's really contributed a lot. And as far as the zoning, it's worked out. So the way the library is, the second floor is actually the main floor level. And then there's another level underneath that's level 1 that's like sort of half below grade. And so that level 2 really has become and was intended to be the most lively of all of the space, of all of the floors.
Mm-hmm.
As you go up in the building, it actually gets sort of quieter and quieter. The building, I don't know if we mentioned, but it has four floors and then a 5th floor in the 60s component. So this is a 5-floor library, which is unique.
Mm-hmm.
It's enabled us to do this in terms of the zoning. The other thing I'll say about it is, as Amanda was saying, you've got all of these pieces, right? 60s, 80s. And one of the main things that we wanted to do was create a cohesive building.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to feel like you're in the old part of the building or the new part of the building, or the good part, the bad part, right? So we really made it cohesive. And I think doing the renovation floor by floor has really helped reveal how impactful it is. Because now we sort of have these 2 entries. We created a new entry. The second floor becomes also like a pass-through for students. And so they pass through, they see how amazing it is, and then they want to come there and study. So I think it's just really worked out very well in terms of that zoning. And to Frank's point, although difficult with the phasing, it had a good result.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting touring through the space. I am a sucker for wood. So my opinion is very biased, but yeah, the wood detailing, I think adds, like you guys were saying, this like very warm and inviting, especially where, it's like you're saying, like they're pancakes. So if you're kind of like on the interior of the building, you're not by a window, you're losing kind of that connection, but bringing that wood into the space, I think helps offset that quite a bit. And then and again, touring the space, like looking at the variety of product there, trying to, kind of meet multiple different needs. It does still looks very unifying, right? As an environment. I mean, it's clearly working because like I said, it was just packed with people. I mean, it's clearly like, from a behavior perspective, I'm always like, well, people, their behavior tells you what's working. And if they're there and they're clearly choosing to go there, something is working in that. So I guess same question to you, Frank. What, from your perspective, like, what do you think has been kind of most successful in the space?
Well, I could talk about each phase individually. They've all been successful, but I'd like to comment before I forget a little bit on the ceiling height, which, seems to be rather innocuous, but the building, the original 2 phases, the ceiling heights are fairly low, which was in vogue, 40, 50 years ago. And I was very concerned as we removed stacks and opened up the building, that you'd get that feeling of that being encroached upon by that low ceiling. But somehow, again, our architects, you all did something, because I don't have that feeling that the ceiling is sitting on top of you. Also, I had thought originally, well, because there's like a 4-foot plenum space, I thought, well, surely we can move those ceilings up a little bit. No, No, because of all the duct work and whatever.
Mhm.
So we might have moved them up 6 inches, but I think again, you all interjected these gap spaces in the ceilings where there's no ceiling tile, where you look up, it's the industrial thing. But that's very clever, because you can do that too far where it ends up looking like a warehouse. But what you all did was you interlaced with sections of open space, and then you'd go 50 feet with drop ceiling, and then you'd have or 40 feet. You have another strip of open space. Maybe that is doing part of that psychological visual effect. But and I don't think the ceiling height issue is insignificant, because we couldn't do anything about it. So I just wanted to mention that.
What's
as far
interesting you
as
say that,
go ahead,
like,
go ahead.
is just to jump in there. As an outsider coming in, it's interesting both here you pick up on that. That's something I didn't even notice. Right? I just like walking through, it's not something I picked up on. And I feel like, in touring spaces you can kind of tell, like, oh yeah, it's like, it's a low ceiling, you're kind of getting secluded. And so maybe you're right. It's the architectural detailing, it's the lighting, finishing, furniture selection, all of it. Yeah, it seems to work, and it doesn't, the low ceiling, it doesn't seem to be affecting.
Right.
So sorry, I cut you off, but
no.
What would you say? So the ceilings,
so
whatever you guys did, low ceiling, that seems to work. What else would you say is successful?
We have this beautiful new event space. It's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. I don't know if you and I were able to go in there, but for decades, the library had this very modest, almost homely little event room. And we'd almost be embarrassed, like, when the president of the university would come over for a lecture or some kind of, program, and it would almost be embarrassing. But, I feel like we've grown up. So we have this gorgeous 120 seat event room, which is in one of the newer additions. And by virtue of that, we were able to push up the ceiling height in the event room. Well, here's a success. And again, I tend to pick on the less glamorous things. Power. The student, it's like oxygen for the students. We had to provide power. We have power to, I would say, 85 to 90% of the seating. And some of that was done, and a lot of libraries are doing this, but I think we pulled it off really, really well. Some of it you pull from columns, some of it you pull from exterior walls. And then we did a lot, and then we did a lot of core drilling too.
Okay.
To pull up from the floors. So it's little things like that I think really make a project successful from a practical standpoint. Because everybody talks about longer batteries with portable devices. Well, it doesn't seem to be happening. The first thing the students do when they sit down is they're looking for an outlet. So we added we're adding with each phase, we're adding about 30 group study rooms per floor. These are the private group study rooms with a door. The students love them. There's a lot of collaboration that goes on. The coursework now requires teams and collaboration. So we had 28 group study rooms in the building pre-renovation, and we're on our way to 90. I think we'll be at 60 plus with this next phase. And by the way, they're booked literally 100% of the time. They're self-bookable 2 weeks out, and they are booked literally 100%. We could probably have 500 group study rooms, but that wouldn't be a good use of space. Well, 200. But that's been another huge success. So I could go on and on. I'll stop.
Well, what about you showed me there's a space, you had the group study rooms with the closed door, but then you had like the 3-walled study rooms that are not closed off, but that you were talking about.
How did you all design those to make them, you all can speak to I call them alcoves.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we wanted some variety.
Mm-hmm.
And then also it just actually allowed us to do more with the space, because if you don't have
Mm-hmm.
glass in the door and the, all the clearances around these things, then you can actually do more of them. And it allowed to sort of push and pull some of those study rooms. And it's not just a row of study rooms, right? It's got a little bit of in and out with those alcoves. So that was also part of the intention.
Interesting.
Yeah, but it was a space savings thing also for ADA, for code. You need the turning circle inside the room if you have glass in a door and the maneuvering clearances. And if you don't have glass in the door, you stay 5 or 6 feet times, the width of the study room. So that's a substantial amount of square footage each time you're saving. So I think they're effective because we also space them, reasonably far apart where acoustically they still work.
Yeah, I mean, from a behavior standpoint, again, they were full. And you're probably saving money because you're not having to put the glass in the door and everything like that. So you can kind of, I mean, obviously you don't want all of that, right? But it's probably a nice balancing in there to hit a middle ground.
Yeah, and the other nice element of variety, those alcoves are not reservable.
Okay.
Which I think, students, there's probably a certain amount of spontaneity sometimes with students. So, we didn't book a room, let's see if we can find one of the alcoves. So that's another type of variety.
That probably helps too. I feel like I speak to someone that their anxiety runs a little high from time to time. Then it's like, I almost feel like it works against when it's like everything's always bookable. Well, it's good, but you don't book it. And then you're almost like, well, I can't go there because everything's always booked. I think that's probably helps the success of the space. You have 30 books, and then it's like, yes, there's just first come, first serve in there. So anything else like from a success you'd want to share? Because then I want to kind of get your perspective, Frank, on like what maybe you think. Now you've had this phased approach. It's been there for a while. You've been living in this space. Maybe what didn't work, but anything else from a success?
Well, I think having the second entrance, we haven't talked about that. That was also a code requirement, if I recall, to have a certain amount of egress. But the second entrance, I mean, this would play better if everybody could see a visual. But the new north entrance faces the student union and the retail center with the bookstore. So that was another stroke of genius, because what do I know? I had actually favored having the second entrance on the side, which I probably never even spoke with you all much about, but that would have not been nearly as successful. So we have a second entrance that faces the union and the retail center. So you have 3 of the most important buildings on campus that are now in their own like nexus, there's a central plaza. And that is literally like, if you had to say, what is the heart of campus? That spot on that plaza is the heart of campus. And so this wonderful new library entrance opens up into that plaza. Well, we could go on. And again, this would work better if the audience could see floor plans. But the architects also designed a fabulous reading room on top of the arc. Not unlike what was done at University of Chicago, but I'm going to say that I think ours is a little bit more beautiful and more aesthetically pleasing. I mean, nothing against the University of Chicago's egg, but you just have to see this reading room to appreciate it. And again, because it's part of the newer space, the architect was able to push the ceilings, that we weren't constrained. We were able to push the ceilings way high. So we have this beautiful reading room. When we say the word reading room, it sort of harkens back to older libraries, but very cleverly, you all employed more modern motifs so that the room wouldn't, look kind of ridiculously old-fashioned. So it was very cleverly furnished. And again, kudos to you all for the way the room was furnished.
And we've got images that we can kind of share of that.
Good.
It definitely has a unique look. I don't know if you guys call it. We call it the Alice in Wonderland room. sometimes because of the uniqueness of the furniture in the space.
Yeah, I think that students, it has its own Reddit page now. And so
Okay.
both, I think it's they debate between the Alice in Wonderland space or the like Harry Potter,
Mm. Mm.
but it just has a sense of being somewhere really exciting, right? It doesn't feel like anywhere else. It's very specific. And the president, talking about the president, being embarrassed to host him, he now wants to film all of his promotional videos in the reading room. He loves it so much. So it's really wonderful. And, the university leaders want to use the building as a backdrop
Mm-hmm.
to be in.
Yeah, no, that's great. So again, not wanting to take away from all the successes that the project has, but I think there's always great kind of learnings and especially the phase approach. Like you guys talked a little bit about this. Like what do you think hasn't, worked in the space? And Frank, I'll start with you. Like what do you think maybe hasn't worked kind of as it's evolved?
I really, you sent us the questions in advance, Joe. I've really been struggling with this, and
well, you're very proud of your space and very passionate about it.
Well,
it's great.
Clearly there have been, no failures. And I really, I don't know if you all, from an architectural standpoint, maybe from a mechanical engineering standpoint, Delia and Amanda, y'all might be able to come up with some things. We did have a close call. The third floor, which is the most recent space that was renovated, we had designed a room with about 200 seats that was going to be a graduate student space exclusively. And it was outfitted with doors that could be closed that would enable card swipe or card tap for access control to limit who goes in there. And it had a couple of little features in it, like electronically adjustable study tables and, a few niceties that would, set it apart from the rest of the building. And at the last moment, our new library dean, and I got to give him a lot of credit because it was gutsy call, he called it off. He said, no, we're not going to designate that for a particular group of students. He said he just wasn't comfortable doing that. And I think he made the right call because for a couple of reasons. Number one, who's to know that maybe that's a lot of seats. There may be well over 200 seats in there. What if it ended up being, underpopulated?
Mm-hmm.
And the other reason was just the headaches of having that room accessible through, a card swipe. What if the system's down one day, or what if the student can't get the card to work, and they go to a service desk and, how do I get in there? Can you get me in there? And so, I think we made the right call in not limiting it to a certain group of students.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to what didn't work, I think some isolated cases of furniture, and we've talked about this with Amanda and Delia. One thing I've observed over the years is you want your furniture to have as few moving parts as possible, because the students will, not intentionally, they will beat it up. Like, limit the number of chairs that have adjustable seat height, that spindly little adjuster underneath. In an office environment, you might adjust it, once a month.
Mm-hmm.
Out on the floor, that little spindly arm adjuster is getting yanked and pulled on 4 or 5 times a day. Because if you have, rotation of students.
Yeah.
So, tables with spindly little legs, the students will sit on coffee tables, and they'll think it's perfect. Well, they'll sit on them. And so, you do that a couple of hundred times, and, those leg tables better be very sturdy. So I think, we're learning, but honestly, I think, again, it goes back to doing the renovations one phase at a time. I'm having a hard time coming up with failures. I'll turn it over to Amanda and Delia.
Yeah, Yeah, I think you're right. Probably the phase is helping that quite a bit. So yeah, Amanda, Delia, I mean, what, obviously coming from architecture interior perspective, what would you guys say would be maybe hasn't worked or what you've learned? Well, I guess we'll get to what you learned next, but you're just curious, like, what do you think hasn't worked over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think Frank really hit it out of the park, and I've listed most of those things that Frank already said. But I think one of the things that didn't work, to be perfectly transparent, and we've had lots of conversations about this, was when we did the third floor, which really was the first big pancake floor to renovate, right? It was the first time we were exposing, so we knew a little bit. The first time we were exposing existing structures for both buildings, right? There were a lot of unknowns, a lot of things. And so the very first time we did the furniture layout, to Frank's point, we needed a lot of core drills in the floor plan. But we realized that we weren't looking at the structural slab plans when we'd initially laid those out, right? And it's a big waffle slab. So some parts of the structure are super deep and then certain parts get really thin.
Sure.
You could only place those core drills in the thin parts, right? And so we had a lot of kind of like, moments where the contractor had shifted the core drills just a little bit, 10 or 12 inches one direction or another. And all of a sudden we came in and, well, the furniture wasn't working. So we just did a really fast re-space planning and got it all to fit finally. But that's been kind of a lesson learned we've taken forward, as we now have these like overlays of the slab plans to expose the structure. We have them now. And when we do the furniture layout and the core drills, we have to turn those on to make sure anywhere we say we need to do a core drill, it's in the skinny part of the waffle slab and not the, thick part. So that was, I think, for us, one of the biggest challenges, primarily just because it was an existing building and dealing with all of those things. And then I think in terms of lessons learned, it's 1,000% to do with furniture, just because there's so much. And those students are like the heaviest possible users. I mean, someone could sit in a seat every 15 minutes, every hour. They're rotating out of them. And so to Frank's points, our list of things is the no moving mechanisms. Absolutely. Heavy steel supports under tables. Obviously, Joe being with Agati, y'all know you test your furniture to be sat on, to be stood on.
Sure.
Some manufacturers don't. They'll give you the answer of, we design it to fail if someone sits or stands on it. Well, the students are going to do that.
Sure.
And we want to minimize the amount of warranty requests for the library. So every phase we've been kind of, if products have consistently failed, even though we felt like we vetted them, we felt like we tested them, we obviously eliminate them in future things. Because we were testing a laptop table the other day, and I walked up and a guy was sitting in the chair next to it and a girl was sitting on the laptop table talking to him, right? And they're using his chairs. And so I think we've avoided all of those things. And then lastly, when we came in with that Knowledge Commons renovation that they've done not too much earlier, most of the fabrics were failing on them. They were breaking, they were cracking, they were fraying, like they were really, really, really in terrible shape. Yeah. And so Frank helped me. We went around and I did a real deep dive and figuring out exactly what was specified. And we've done massive amount of works. Yeah. And so what should we specify in terms of what's going to be the most durable fabric for this high use library? Yeah. And we really came to, it either needs to be a woven textile, which some people don't like. It needs to be actual yarns. It can't be a vinyl. It can't be a polyurethane. It can't be a coated. Or there was sort of this new type of coated silicones that came out when we were really starting. They're not new today, but they were kind of new when we were starting. And so we said, well, let's test it, right? That was one of those case studies where we were like, we desperately hope this is going to work. It's pricey, but let's try it. And it's really worked incredibly well. Okay. And it still looks like brand new, the same it did as the day we installed it. And I think that's been kind of a lesson learned into a success, is just our experience with some of these materials in those heavy, high use abuse situations.
Yeah, fabric, that's a good point to bring up. I mean, because you got a lot of fabric in that space. And that's always like, you can do a lot of things underneath, foam, frame, things like that. But the fabric is like usually the weakest part, but the most abused part, right? Yeah, interesting. So I mean, I guess you touched a little bit on lessons learned. Is there anything else you want to add, Delia? Then I'm gonna kind of throw it over to Frank.
No, I mean, I think those are really some of the big things that we talked about, but I just want to piggyback on something Amanda talked about regarding the outlets. And the thing that people don't talk about because it's kind of mundane, but it's as extraordinarily important is circuiting the outlets. People don't think about this, but when you core, put a hole in the floor and then you put a power outlet in there, you have to make sure that it's going to be able to power all of the things you're connecting to it.
Sure.
Because you can go over that amount. So we had to really also look at how many people were sitting in each of these clusters, how many outlets we had per cluster. Because we knew, well, if we have 6 people sitting in this cluster and they're plugging in multiple devices, like we're going to need to add another circuit, right?
Yeah.
And it's, again, mundane, but like if you don't know, it can be very challenging and really screw things up. So
yeah, power is an interesting one. Like we're furniture people, and I usually tell people like, look, I went to art school, I'm not like electrical engineer, but it is by far the most complex conversations we have when it comes to power. And it's funny to hear you say like, oh, well, like, we had to, the GC move this outlet, that outlet. And it's like, I used to tell people, I'm like, look, we just plan for it just not to be where it's supposed to be. Or maybe you get a 50% hit rate, and that's usually a good project, because maybe you're just like, okay, we didn't put it in the thick part of the slab, but they hit a rebar, so they had to move it. And the GC is like, oh, it's within 6 inches. I'm like, but 6 inches in the furniture world is a pretty big move. In the GC world, they're like, that's good. But you're right. It's a very complex, very nuanced conversation that I think a lot of people don't have early enough. I mean, we have projects where people are like, we want it hardwired. We want it hardwired. We want hardware the whole way. I'm like, okay. And we've caught a few of them. We're like, are you sure you want it hardwired? And then they'll finally like, well, what does hardwired mean? Like, oh, I'm like, do you have wires coming out of the ground? They're like, no, it's a bunch of outlets. I'm like, then you don't want hardwired. You need an outlet. You need to plug it in. They're like, oh yeah. I'm like, yeah. So you're right. I mean, I can empathize with you a little bit, like having that conversation early. And then what is the box? That is usually I always ask, like, what box are you using? I always like the ones that are like the flip up door with the recessed kind of cord. That gives you the most, like, at least for our stuff, gives you the most flexibility. But a lot of times it's like, yeah, just throw that thing in there. It's like, it's always hard when it's an afterthought. So besides power, Frank, would there be any kind of lessons learned that you would?
Well,
say?
Here's another power thing. And again, we're getting into the weeds here.
Yeah.
Don't put a power outlet on a column that you don't intend for students to use. We have a couple of famous examples of that. We've got columns that are like right on the edge of a walkway, and the student, they were not really intended to be used by students. I don't know, maybe housekeeping with the vacuum cleaners, but the students either drag the furniture over to the column, which is now in the walkway, or they run an extension cord from the table over to the column, which creates a tripping hazard. So it is little things like that.
Yeah.
I think you learn kind of as you go. I think, Amanda, we're learning as we go with the power thing. But so we'll move on from power. I mean, we've talked about fabrics. I think we've talked about furniture. The furniture is massively important. I mean, it kind of makes or breaks the project. Because ultimately, if you think about it, you spend tens of millions of dollars, and, the student is going to want a comfortable piece of furniture that has utility, or they're not going to come back. So it's like that final piece is critical. And we spoke about this earlier. I've counted on some floors, we'll have like 7 different styles of furniture within a 50-foot radius, and that's all intentional. But in terms of I think we've pretty well covered it. And I think, again, we did the sit testing with students. We surveyed the students. We had charrettes with students. So it's not just, we hope we get this right. There was a lot of homework that went into it. And so, I mean, our architects would fly down just to do like charrettes and those little exercises where you take the little sticky and you put it on a photograph of something. This is what's my favorite piece of furniture, you know, the little affinity thing, and it all works. So I don't really have anything else to share regarding failure. I think it's just good planning. And again, I want to give our architects, I mean, the state, the university could have hired, you know, and there's a lot of good architects in Florida. I don't want to say there isn't, but I've been to enough libraries where you can see like a cookie cutter design where they just crank it out. You know, I'm talking academic libraries where they, you know, so we found an architect, and it was all competitively done, the process, that had expertise in libraries, academic libraries, public event space, right? Theaters, you know, they all kind of have commonalities. So, you know, that plays a huge part. So,
so I'll just kind of, we're kind of winding down here, and we went over a lot of great stuff. I think a lot of great successes, lessons learned, you know, maybe what you do and do next. In similar line, along similar lines, what would you do maybe now that because you're getting close to the end of the renovations, right? I think you have maybe 1 phase or 2 phases left in theory.
We still have the second floor, the remainder of the second floor. We still have the remainder of the first floor. And then we would have to go back up to that partial 5th floor. I think those are the things that are left. So I think phases are still TBD as funding comes in, but we still have 2.5 out of 5 floors done. So I mean, we're probably past the halfway point because the ARC was a big bulk of that, and it's on all 4 floors. But, you know, so we're somewhere probably at the 65% done. But after all this time, yeah, we still have a few floors to do something differently next time, I suppose.
So I guess that's my question to maybe start with you, Frank. Like, now that you're here, would you do anything different at this point?
Well, we actually did do a course correction on the 4th floor, which is the new floor being built right now. We had a late change where we created a technology studio, which had not been part of any of the early renditions or even later renditions. It will have podcast studios, data visualization room, photo video suite, something called an XR lab, which I honestly am not, I need to study up on that.
Reality. Yeah.
So we're extremely excited about this for obvious reasons. I mean, you know, there's a limit to how much just general seating you want to do, you know, in a library. So I think this technology studio is going to give us a nice differentiation, and it might help partially define that 4th floor. Oh, that's where the tech studio is, 4th floor. So, so again, see, that wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been a phased project. So, these little course corrections are, I think, alleviating some of this second guessing and, oh, well, what would we have done differently? We're able to do it kind of on the fly as we go. So I don't know if y'all have any comments on that.
Yeah, I guess, but to you, Delia and Amanda, what would you guys do? I mean, like you said, you're probably past the 50%, maybe, you know, 65% of the project. Is there anything you would do differently now? I mean, you have opportunities to do things differently.
I think that's really, it comes down to that programming piece that Frank's talking about. And so we did do like an advanced planning of the whole library in 2014, I believe that was issued. So 10 years ago now. And so again, I think everyone's always like, well, how do we plan for the future, right? It's a big question that comes up. Like, well, how do we plan for that? Well, it's just a real challenge because you kind of can't imagine what you can't imagine, or you don't know how technology is going to evolve. And so I think we've taken those opportunities to reevaluate the program, always thinking about, what is the highest and best use for the students to Frank's point. And some of those technology services were just missing on their campus, and the library felt called to really provide those for the students to support them in their academic education. So I think that was something that we've always done, like sort of lessons learned on for all of the floors as we go. And that's really, I think, one of the biggest things that we're trying to get right at every juncture is thinking about what does this look like? How are we supporting this? I think looking to the future now, we have been looking at the second floor, and they have this fabulous coffee client vendor that's providing services. And so we're sort of working to build upon that and kind of make this coffee shop, third place, hangout lounge.
Okay.
They've implemented an incredible service to students where they check out technology. Like if you don't have a laptop, or you don't have a video camera, or you don't have, I mean, it goes on and on and on. I'm sure Frank could rattle off the list of equipment. I mean, it's just incredible pieces of equipment that you wouldn't even imagine loaning, like a USB cable, this, that, or the other thing. It's the LibTech desk, and it has this massive line. It's wildly exploded. It's incredibly popular. And so we're just exponentially increasing that and those services. So just thinking through, like, what are those new services? Like, not just like, okay, let's add another 500 seats because they need seats. Right. What are the services that the programs are supporting? And I think that's at every phase kind of what we would do differently is we restart and say, okay, let's not just say, yep, we planned this. Okay, done. Let's crank it out. Let's execute. We have those conversations with the library and with the students about, okay, no, this is what we had, but what do we need to adjust? What do we need to change? What do we need to do differently? And we're validating that at every phase.
It's great.
Well, one thing, if I could just add a footnote to the Tech Studio, one of the beautiful things about this new Tech Studio that we're building, I mean, the truth, UCF has these types of tech labs on campus. Because UCF's, some of our strongest programs are in engineering and computer science, but a lot of them, most of them are available only to the students in that college. So this is the wonderful thing about libraries. So we seized upon that and said, no, we're going to have a tech studio that's open to everybody, all students across the university. And so that it was part of the rationale and the wisdom behind doing this in the library. You know, it's like because it'll be open to everyone. So,
no, that makes a lot of sense. And then Delia, I can give you the last word. Is there anything that you would do differently now that you're kind of here?
I mean, I think, again, just as everyone's sort of been saying, just the fact that we've been able to kind of continuously do this has really enabled us to rethink a lot of those things. I mean, student behaviors are constantly changing. And so having the ability to see how those behaviors are changing and plan for the future, for the next floor renovation and so on, is extremely helpful, because we can build flexibility into our spaces. We know that, but having that additional knowledge, I think, puts us a little bit in the driver's seat in terms of, okay, well, yes, we want it to be flexible, but we can actually steer it in this direction because we know what has happened before. And so I think we've just had a huge advantage in being able to do that. So our lessons learned are continuing constantly. I think we're just able to act on them as quickly as we can. So,
and Frank's given us a lot of prompts. I want to give him a ton of props as well, and just the library staff in general. They have been so passionate about making this space for the students and what the students need. They have been the student body's biggest advocates every step of the way. We've been working with Frank in particular for years and years and years, and it's just been such an incredible partnership, honestly. I feel like we are so lucky to have had them as clients, because it's just been a wonderful collaboration. And I think that's what makes it such a successful project, is their commitment to doing the right thing for a student body. So applause to Frank
Well,
and
thank you.
as
And
well.
while we're complimenting each other, I'm also going to say, Joe, your company, we have a lot of different lines of furniture in this building and a lot of good lines. But I will say that the Agati is some of the most well-received, best built. I mean, again, there are others that are fine furniture, but the pieces that you all have provided are some of the sturdiest and most utilitarian and most well thought out. So
I appreciate that.
Thank you for being a partner with us on this.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I appreciate all your guys' time today. I mean, I think this is what's drawn me to this. And I know we've had conversations separately. There's a lot of passion, I think, both from Frank and folks at Steinberg Hart, like around the project. It's had this unique history, this unique kind of evolution. And so I really appreciate you guys taking the time today to kind of share that with everybody.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right.
Our
Thanks,
pleasure.
guys.